In 1945, Germany ceased to be a country and became a territory shattered by defeat and occupation. From the east, millions of ethnic Germans were expelled from Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary, facing long marches, overcrowding on trains and indiscriminate killings. The roads were filled with exhausted families, dragging the little they could amidst hunger, disease and cold, while the weakest were left behind without aid. In cities and towns, the return of those fleeing coincided with the massive arrival of displaced people from other regions, generating overcrowding, tensions, and a daily struggle for a plate of food or a roof. The state structure had disappeared, and with it any stable form of organization, leaving communities without protection or basic services. The streets were left to the mercy of gangs, personal vendettas and looting. Formal commerce was replaced by bartering and makeshift markets, where clothes, firewood or tools were exchanged for bread or medicine. Life unfolded amidst ruins and an institutional void, in an environment where norms had dissolved and survival was the only possible order. What was left to lose? The total military collapse. On the first day of 1945, Goebbels wrote in his diary that enemy air attacks continued day and night, especially over Koblenz, Kassel and Cologne, noting that Koblenz had been hit particularly hard and that Cologne was becoming a mountain of rubble, while the inhabitants remaining there led a life of constant torment. He recounted a recent bombing in Heilbronn which, according to a collaborator sent to the scene, left the city between 70% and 80% destroyed, without water, gas or electricity, with a dejected population and a gloomy mood, and he wondered how much more the people could resist before falling into total apathy. Although at that time the military situation did not seem to fully worsen this deterioration, he believed it was only a pause before the true chaos, and he was right. A few days later, the Soviet army launched the largest ground offensive ever recorded, breaking the fragile balance on the Eastern Front and destroying any illusion that Nazi Germany could avoid disaster, precipitating the regime's collapse in January. The slaughter that unfolded at the beginning of that year was unprecedented. After years in which German forces had brought terror across Europe, violence returned to their own territory with unprecedented intensity. As the Nazi Empire retreated and the Allies advanced from both fronts, with the country almost defenseless in the air, the war completely shifted to German soil. The last few months were the bloodiest. In January alone, when the Soviets advanced from the Vistula to the Oder in a matter of weeks, more than 450,000 German soldiers died, a figure that far exceeded the combined total of American and British casualties throughout the entire war. In February, March and April, German combat deaths exceeded 280,000 each month, and more than one-fourth of all German military losses were concentrated in the last 4 months, with more soldiers killed in that period than in all of 1942 and 1943 combined, most within the country's borders. Allied casualties, especially Soviet ones, were even higher. In the Battle for Berlin, which lasted 3 weeks, the Red Army suffered more than 300,000 casualties, and it is estimated that in the first month of the year, more than 1 million people died. Meanwhile, millions of Germans fled the Soviet advance, many not surviving the harsh winter, and Allied bombings reached their most intense point, as with German air defences ineffective and the entire territory within reach, more bombs were dropped than ever before. Low-flying aircraft could freely attack both soldiers and civilians, and within the areas still controlled by the regime, German forces themselves applied extreme measures against the population and foreign workers to maintain order, suppress defeatism, and prevent any attempt at surrender, repeating methods from the collapse of 1918. Germany was caught in a whirlwind of total destruction. What happened from January onwards was not a simple continuation of the suffering of 1944, but a leap in intensity and form. Although Germany continued to fight, it no longer did so with the hope of resisting or reaching an agreement, and outnumbered and outgunned, the Wehrmacht fought without considering replacements or resources, prolonging the conflict through inertia. Cities suffered what they had previously inflicted: evacuations, bombings, street fighting and occupation, while military capacity diminished on all fronts. Defensive lines gave way, territory was divided, and units were isolated in battles without strategic meaning. Still, at the beginning of the year, some believed that the worst could be avoided. Germany maintained about 7 million active soldiers, and although the controlled territory was shrinking, it still held a large part of the country and other occupied areas. In the west, the Ardennes offensive had failed, but the Allies had not crossed the Rhine. In the east, the Soviets remained stopped at the Vistula, and the Germans held a good part of Poland, even achieving tactical victories on a 900-kilometer front. At sea, the fleet was still operational, and unlike in 1918, its crews maintained discipline, which led Dönitz to assure Hitler that the navy was the complete opposite of that of the previous war. Since the Normandy landings and the Soviet offensive in June, German forces had suffered enormous losses. France had been recovered by the Allies, and some 30 divisions were trapped in Courland and Memel, supplied only by sea, but the Nazi army still organized defenses and maintained lines. Therefore, even after the failure in the Ardennes, leaders like Reinhard Gehlen, head of intelligence on the Eastern Front, proposed reinforcing with 20 or 30 divisions to counterattack and force Stalin to negotiate, although these ideas lacked a real basis. On the first day of January, divisions of the Waffen-SS launched an offensive in Hungary ordered by Hitler to liberate Budapest, which was surrounded by the enemy, and secure vital oil wells. Hitler insisted that without that resource it was impossible to continue, and although the effort was senseless, additional troops were sent. The fighting lasted until March, and Stalin described it as some of the toughest of the war. The result was similar to that of the Ardennes. The Wehrmacht could still inflict damage but could not alter the outcome, and the offensive only accelerated the collapse. In January, it still seemed that the war was fought mostly outside Germany. Although some areas were already occupied and several cities destroyed, most of the fighting took place in foreign territory, as had happened in 1918 or in the Franco-Prussian War. But in 1945 that situation changed abruptly. The final phase was defined by the imbalance between Allied power and German exhaustion. The Wehrmacht maintained its internal structure almost until the end, but resorted to suicidal tactics. 17-year-olds sent to the front without preparation, the last reserves spent on a defense with no future, and command decisions that condemned soldiers and civilians alike without opposition at the top, in a strategy that lacked all military logic. The regime's fanaticism was also reflected in its attempts to mobilize the population. Faced with the imminent invasion, all men between 16 and 60 years of age were called to the Volkssturm, a popular armed militia presented as a heroic defense inspired by the struggle of 1813 against Napoleon. In a speech, Himmler promised that every kilometer would cost rivers of blood, assuring that towns, cities and forests would be defended by young people, the elderly, and, if necessary, by women, and that guerrillas would operate behind enemy lines. That was the image of the end that the regime transmitted, reinforced by Hitler's last message, in which he assured that what happened in 1918 would not be repeated, and that resistance would continue until the enemy was broken. Uncontrolled violence in German cities. In the makeshift courts, an anonymous accusation was enough, and the prisons were full of people arrested for listening to foreign radios, for complaining about rationing, or for not showing enough enthusiasm for the war, with many of those prisoners being killed before the Allies arrived. Lynchings became frequent amidst the climate of paranoia, and neighbors distrusted each other. There were those who denounced acquaintances for stealing food or speaking against Hitler, and some citizens organized local patrols to watch streets, check documents and punish those who escaped civil defense orders. In cities near the front, public beatings became a spectacle. Women who talked with enemy soldiers were whipped, merchants accused of hiding goods were beaten, and children were attacked for stealing bread. The confusion and fear generated an atmosphere in which any sign of weakness could cost one's life. Allied troops, as they advanced through German territory, found an exhausted and disorganized population, and in many cases they did not distinguish between combatants and civilians. There were reports of shootings in villages without resistance, and upon entering destroyed cities, some units opened fire at the slightest suspicion. In other areas, the vacuum after the German withdrawal favored looting and revenge, and some soldiers acted on their own. Executions without trial and abuse against unarmed residents were reported, and in certain towns, civilians were forcibly gathered to witness punishments or hand over personal belongings. Mass arrests became a common image, and anyone wearing a uniform, insignia, party documents, or who had worked in regime offices was detained. The conditions in the detention centers were precarious, with a shortage of food, beds, and medical care. Many prisoners spent weeks without outside contact, and the accusations were imprecise, ranging from belonging to National Socialist organizations to suspicion of collaboration or direct retaliation. Improvised camps were filled with everyone from adolescents recruited into the Volkssturm to elderly people who had served as local officials, and sometimes troops destroyed entire homes as a collective punishment. There were also cases where former prisoners liberated by the Allies, including camp survivors, retaliated, attacking captured guards or citizens who had participated in the repressive system. Although many of these acts were not organized, they reflected the total collapse of any legal norm, and in several areas authority depended exclusively on force. The one who had a weapon commanded. Even after the cessation of fighting, incidents of sporadic violence, armed robberies, and settling of scores between neighbors continued. The impossible escape from eastern Germany. The crossing of the frozen Frischeshaff Lake was one of the most dramatic scenes. Civilians trying to escape ventured onto the frozen surface while bombs fell from the sky, and some heavy vehicles broke the ice and sank with all their occupants. Others were hit by artillery fire, leaving scattered corpses and remains on the ice. Among the dead were children, the elderly, and pregnant women, with no protection whatsoever. Desperation led many to risk unstable routes, because the only alternative was to stay behind and face an uncertain fate. The evacuation trains did not offer security either. The few available ones were packed with people hanging from the steps, with overcrowded and unheated wagons. Many died during the journey, suffocated or frozen. In numerous areas, the tracks were bombed and the convoys were stopped halfway, forcing passengers to continue on foot, carrying children and belongings over the snow. The scenes of mothers walking barefoot with their children in their arms were repeated throughout the winter. The lack of shelter was another serious problem. Churches, barns, and abandoned houses were occupied by groups of families without any organization, and diseases spread quickly in those enclosed, unsanitary spaces. Dysentery, typhus, and typhoid fever caused thousands of deaths. Without medicine, without doctors, without blankets or food, the weakest did not survive more than a few days. In some towns, corpses accumulated with no time or means to bury them, and the fields were strewn with frozen bodies. In the midst of this situation, violence was constant. There were lootings, aggressions, lynchings, and improvised executions on the roads. People identified as collaborators of the Nazi regime were attacked without trial or evidence, and clashes also occurred between the civilians themselves when resources were scarce. Some fled with animals, which caused assaults from others looking for meat to feed themselves. The caravans of fleeing people were vulnerable to any attack, as most moved without escort and without protection. The overwhelmed local authorities stopped giving coherent orders. Some party leaders fled before the residents themselves, and others tried to impose discipline without having the means to achieve it. In many cases, it was the German soldiers who were still resisting who maintained a minimum of order, but their priority was to stop the enemy and not to protect the civilian population. When the detachments withdrew, they left the people abandoned. The regime's propaganda also failed. It had assured that the army would defend those regions until the end, which led many families not to leave on time. The arrival of the Soviet troops accelerated the collapse. The villages were occupied one after another, and the accounts of the survivors describe scenes of violence, searches, fires, and disappearances. Witnesses narrated how women were forced out of their hiding places and taken to houses occupied by soldiers. The few churches that remained standing served as temporary refuge, but the protection was limited. In the rural areas, many families went into the forests, where the cold and lack of food eliminated them one by one. The disorder of the flight also caused records and documents to be lost. Entire families disappeared without any record of their fate, and many children were left alone after losing their parents on the way. Some were taken in by strangers, while others were never identified. In the following months, the Allied authorities tried to reconstruct a census, but thousands were still unaccounted for. The lists of the missing were incomplete. Some were recorded as dead without confirmation, while others reappeared years later in different parts of the country or in displaced persons camps. In Silesia, the main roads became saturated. The columns of people stretched for kilometers, and there were traffic jams at the access points to bridges and tunnels. Some tried to cross through swampy areas and got trapped. The horses could not advance, and the carts were immobilized. Those who had bicycles or improvised wheelbarrows were able to move a little faster. but they were still exposed to air attacks. The traffic signs were torn down or altered, disorienting those who did not know the terrain. The majority of those fleeing were women, children, and the elderly, since the young men were at the front or had already died. The absence of adults capable of organizing the displacement caused many decisions to be made in a chaotic manner. Mothers were forced to choose between carrying a small child or carrying some food. In more than one case, sick relatives were abandoned to be able to continue. Some communities grouped together to take turns transporting those who could not walk, but that solidarity weakened as conditions worsened. During the crossing of the Vistula, many were attacked from the air. The improvised boats could not withstand the weight or the pressure, and some used doors or furniture as rafts. The currents swept away dozens of people, and corpses appeared downriver for weeks. Those who reached the other bank found soldiers controlling the passage. Some received permission to continue, while others were turned back without explanation, and the decisions depended on each officer's interpretation of the orders. The cities that had served as temporary refuge also collapsed. Breslau, Königsberg and Danzig saw their populations multiply in a few days. Health services stopped functioning, and food distribution systems were overwhelmed. Community kitchens were set up in squares and streets, but they were not enough for everyone. People waited in line for hours for a ration of soup, and many died waiting. The snow accumulated on the bodies, and those who resisted preferred not to look to the sides, with death becoming part of the daily landscape. When some areas came under Soviet control, the displacements did not stop. Many were forced to leave their homes by order of the new authorities, and others fled to the west for fear of retaliation. The German population in the east was drastically reduced, properties were confiscated and documents were invalidated, which included land titles, family records and birth certificates. In certain cases, the houses were occupied by other groups of displaced people, generating new conflicts. The internal collapse of the Nazi regime. The military pressure became unbearable for the regime, and the authorities began to punish any sign of weakness harshly. War tribunals executed soldiers accused of surrendering without a fight or abandoning their positions in a short time, and the collapse of the Eastern Front, coupled with the advance of Allied troops from the West, provoked a reaction of violence directed against the Germans themselves. In many towns, mayors were pressured to prevent any approach with Allied forces, and if someone tried to raise a white flag, they were accused of cowardice. Some were shot for allowing enemy troops to enter without resistance. Party members maintained strict control until the last days, especially in rural areas where the power structure was still operational. There, the ideology was held more firmly, while in the large cities the chaos made it impossible to maintain total control. Suicides increased at an alarming rate. In the capital and other important cities, many people decided to take their own lives in the face of the imminent arrival of the Red Army. The fear was not limited to foreign occupation, but also to internal punishments. There were families who died together using poison or firearms, and in underground shelters it was common to find lifeless bodies next to food remains, burned clothes, or notes explaining the decision. The idea of a defeated Germany was unbearable for those who had grown up under the propaganda of assured victory. Some officials loyal to the regime took this logic to the extreme. In various areas, those in charge of local offices burned documents, destroyed files, and then committed suicide. Preventing evidence from remaining seemed more important than surviving. Some police chiefs made sure that no file fell into the hands of the occupants, and on occasion, before taking their own lives, they executed subordinates they considered disloyal. The fear of a future trial drove desperate and brutal decisions. In the concentration camps, the situation was just as critical. As the Allies approached, those responsible tried to erase the evidence of the crimes committed, forcing prisoners to march long distances to areas still under German control. Many died during those forced transfers, and in other cases they were murdered before the foreign troops arrived. The few who managed to escape said that those last weeks were marked by chaotic and unbridled violence. The structure of the state was rapidly crumbling. Although local leaders were still active in some places, in others authority disappeared completely. The radios broadcast contradictory messages. On one hand, they called to fight until the end. On the other, they recognized the seriousness of the situation. Hitler continued to issue orders from his bunker, but his inner circle had lost all confidence in victory. The distance between reality and the official discourse became evident even for the most loyal. In the south, some units tried to organize improvised defensive lines, but the lack of coordination and resources made it impossible to sustain them. As the days passed, more soldiers surrendered without fighting, preferring to surrender to the Western Allies rather than become prisoners of the Soviets. The Nazi authorities considered that choice as treason, and some commanders ordered to shoot those who tried to flee to the west. In various regions, the civilian population was forced to dig trenches, build barriers, and transport weapons. Adolescents were recruited without training and sent to the front, and in Berlin, youths from the Hitler Youth participated in the final defense of the city. Armed with outdated rifles, they faced Soviet tanks in narrow streets and ruined buildings with very high losses. Despite their inexperience, they were expected to resist until death, and the result was a generation destroyed before reaching adulthood. The chaos also reached the prisons. Some prisoners were released due to lack of surveillance, while others were executed to prevent the Allies from freeing them. In certain cities, the inmates were forced to work on the destruction of files or the elimination of bodies. The rules changed every day, and no one knew what could happen the next, while the penal system collapsed along with the rest of the state apparatus. As institutions crumbled, train stations were rendered useless, routes were blocked, and communications were interrupted. Many towns were isolated, with no news of the enemy's advance or official orders. In some regions, radios were confiscated or destroyed, and newspapers stopped circulating. The population lived in complete bewilderment, not knowing whether to resist, flee, or surrender. Rumors replaced information, and critical decisions were made based on partial messages, speculation, or assumptions. The lack of guidance from the center of power meant that each community faced the collapse in its own way, with improvisation, fear, and contradictory decisions. The rumors grew uncontrollably. There was talk of columns of enemy tanks advancing without resistance, of secret weapons capable of changing the course of the war, or that the Western powers would unite with Germany against communism. None of these beliefs came true. The defeat was inevitable, although the regime insisted on denying it. With each passing day, the collapse became more evident. The end was experienced differently depending on the region. In some towns, soldiers destroyed bridges and roads before withdrawing. In others, they simply disappeared. Civilians were abandoned, houses were looted by their own inhabitants or by retreating soldiers, and in rural areas, the arrival of the Allies brought some order. In contrast, in the cities, the power vacuum generated violence, revenge, and chaos. The feeling that everything was over did not bring peace, but more fear and distrust. Allied reprisals against the population. The conditions faced by foreign workers in Germany were not the same for everyone. Although the French did not suffer the same treatment as the Soviets, they also carried the memory of years under Nazi rule, with acts of arrogance, mistreatment, and violence. And now, integrated into the occupying forces, they had the opportunity to settle scores. The southwestern area of Germany came under the control of the French army, commanded by Lattre de Tassigny, within the American military group led by General Jacob Devers. This force had been organized shortly before and had a high proportion of soldiers from North Africa, which gave rise to rumors, exaggerations, and real events that fueled fear among the local population. Several areas of that region, especially the Black Forest, had suffered little damage during the war, and that combination of intact towns with inhabitants who still maintained an acceptable standard of living, added to the arrival of poorly supplied soldiers who had been mistreated by their own commanders, created a scenario conducive to looting. Violence as a form of revenge was not exclusive to Soviets or French. British and American troops also engaged in similar acts. Among American soldiers, the massacre of more than 70 American prisoners at the hands of an SS armored unit in Malmedy in December 1944 became a symbol. The military press called it a murder on the Western Front, and that news was added to reports of Allied airmen executed after being shot down, hardening attitudes. A soldier wrote to his family that the Germans had been ordered to kill captured paratroopers, and that they had found comrades shot in the back, so they responded in the same way. There were cases in which German prisoners were eliminated after surrendering, and members of the SS became priority targets. An American combatant said that, although it would not be officially admitted, those men were shot even if they surrendered, in retaliation for the atrocities committed under Hitler's regime. They were identified by blood-type tattoos, and although most of the captives were not executed, many suffered robberies, aggressions, and humiliations. Letters reviewed by military censors contained direct confessions. One soldier said he had obtained 2 watches and a pen from prisoners, as well as German marks and a pistol. Another mentioned that a companion had even gotten a German skull. Some boasted of having beaten or shot captives for pleasure. In another message, a soldier sarcastically recounted that he had sent a watch to his family, taken from a German captain, and that when he complained, he simply shot him. Others described how they kicked prisoners for fun. The final scenes of the war did not exclude women. In Würzburg, in April 1945, American soldiers looted, destroyed antique objects, and allowed displaced people to do the same, in addition to committing attacks against local citizens, including rapes attributed to some African-American soldiers, which was etched in the memory of the residents. During the months of March and April, almost 500 American soldiers were prosecuted for this type of crime. The British were not left out either. In Soltau, a town located between Hamburg and Hanover, after the arrival of the troops, several uniformed men consumed alcohol, stripped civilians of jewelry and watches under threat, and raped women, one of whom was attacked by an officer. Although these incidents were numerous, they did not reach the degree of systematic destruction or massive violence that characterized the Soviet advance. What ignited a deep desire for retaliation in the Western troops was what they found upon entering the concentration camps. At that time, the system had already collapsed. Thousands of people had been transferred to facilities that could not contain them, with overcrowded, unsanitary compounds and uncontrolled mortality. In places like Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, soldiers saw skeletal survivors, piled-up corpses, an unbearable stench, and clear evidence of mass murders. Dachau was one of the most notorious cases. There, at the beginning of 1945, more than 100 people died every day from diseases. When the American troops arrived on April 29th, they found more than 30,000 living prisoners and thousands of unburied bodies. In the crematorium complex, there were piles of naked corpses stacked up to 2 meters high. A sergeant from the 6th Division, in charge of illustrating scenes, described train cars full of bodies in striped suits, barracks with more than 40 people crammed into one room, and piles of classified clothing. In the crematorium area, the rooms were almost full to the ceiling with bodies piled up like wood. There were also children's clothes and blood remains next to an embankment where people had been executed. The impression was so intense that many soldiers lost control. On the same day of the liberation, several camp officials were executed by the military. A soldier wrote to his family that, after seeing partially burned bodies and victims murdered shortly before the German withdrawal, his only desire was to kill every German alive. The 42nd and 45th Army Divisions, after weeks of combat, found themselves with that panorama, without encountering resistance, and reacted with fury. A witness, decades later, said that the soldiers deliberately wounded the guards and handed them over to the prisoners so they could take revenge. On one occasion, a military man handed a bayonet to an inmate to behead a jailer. Many guards were wounded in the legs to immobilize them, without distinguishing between guilty and not guilty. Days later, a German communist who had been a prisoner in Dachau tried to collaborate with the Americans in the distribution of food and accommodation, but was threatened by soldiers who blamed him for everything that had happened. They told him that foreigners had lost everything because of him, and that he was lucky to still be alive. For the British, the impact of seeing Bergen-Belsen was similar. Some commanders adopted a punitive stance toward German civilians. A British officer who participated in the liberation and was later appointed head of Munster maintained that vision. The reactions of the liberators, however, fell short of the hatred of those who had been prisoners. An American intelligence officer narrated how a German communist, a Belgian and a liberated Polish professor openly expressed their desire to exterminate the German people. The Pole, who had been through Auschwitz and then Buchenwald, implored divine justice to eliminate all Germans, and the officer admitted that despite the horror, he felt tempted to approve of it internally. Many foreign workers also took advantage of the chaos to take revenge. In newly occupied cities, it was common for curfews to be imposed only on Germans, while Poles and Ukrainians looted shops. In Munich, being barely 4% of the population, displaced people were accused of 3/4 of the crimes. In Görlitz, a priest described a city under foreign control, with local inhabitants hiding and the streets full of garbage after the looting. Some stories were exaggerated, but others, such as that of a Ukrainian who had worked in the Ruhr, proudly told how, upon getting a weapon, they shot Germans as soon as the regime fell. There were also acts of revenge among the Germans themselves. With the collapse of the system, many took the opportunity to settle scores over old feuds. Neighbors with ties to Nazism were denounced, and the new military authorities received letters pointing out former SS members or local leaders who were once feared. In Mecklenburg, after the Soviet arrival in July 1945, a wave of denunciations occurred. This spiral of retaliation, often directed against people with no direct responsibility for the regime's crimes, increased the sense of injustice among the population. The trauma not only came from the defeat, but from becoming the target of widespread resentment, a feeling that fueled the idea among many Germans of seeing themselves as victims in the following years, without stopping to think about what their country had caused in Europe. The German ethnic cleansing in the East. The defeat of the Third Reich in 1945 irreversibly altered the borders that until then had defined Germany. Large areas of what was the old Prussia ceased to be part of the country. These lands had been traditional centers of territorial power, dominated by the agrarian aristocracy known as Junkers. Some of its most emblematic cities had been key in German history: Königsberg, where Immanuel Kant was born, the Hanseatic port of Danzig, where the conflict began in 1939, and Breslau, where the population rose against the French in 1813 and the Iron Cross was instituted. In the months following the collapse of the Nazi regime, one of the largest forced population expulsions in modern times took place. Millions of German citizens were displaced from the old provinces east of the Oder and Neisse rivers, as well as from the Sudetenland. Those regions, which for centuries had a majority German population, came under Polish, Czech or Soviet control. 1/5 of Germany's pre-war territory was separated from the country, and its population was physically or demographically eliminated. For many, this territorial change was the hardest blow of the defeat. There was a growing consensus among the Allies that the eastern regions of Germany, associated with Prussian militarism, should be dismantled. Intellectuals and politicians of the time considered them the origin of an expansionist culture that had to disappear. In addition, the exiled governments of Poland and Czechoslovakia saw the expulsion of German minorities as a legitimate measure, considering them responsible for acting as a fifth column in the years leading up to the war. Although the German residents of East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia and the Sudetenland did not anticipate a definitive uprooting, that possibility became a certainty once the conflict ended. During the last years of the war, support increased among the Allied governments to execute a plan for a massive transfer. The Soviet Union pushed for a shift of the Polish borders to the west, and with it, the displacement of millions of Germans. The United Kingdom and the United States, initially more cautious, ended up supporting this decision. Regarding Czechoslovakia, no alternative was contemplated other than to reverse the agreement signed in Munich 7 years earlier. The goal of avoiding new sources of tension justified the planning of these expulsions, which soon materialized in a series of operations with little humanitarian control. Between 1945 and 1948, about 12 million people of German origin were forced to abandon their homes. Many of them died during the journey. Others were murdered in acts of retaliation or died from starvation, cold, or diseases. In Czechoslovakia, makeshift detention centers were set up where thousands of Germans were imprisoned before their transfer. In some cases, summary executions, torture, and physical violence were documented as part of a process that mixed revenge and ethnic cleansing. In cities like Ústí nad Labem and Brno, massacres against the German population took place, many of them in public spaces and with the knowledge of local authorities. The repression included forced marches under armed custody, in which weakened or sick people were forced to advance, without rest or assistance. In Poland, the properties of the expelled Germans were expropriated and redistributed among the new inhabitants who had arrived from the east, who in turn had been displaced by the Soviet expansion. This phenomenon of cross-transfers generated a complete transformation of the demographic map. Entire towns disappeared or changed their names. German cemeteries were destroyed, churches were reused or demolished, and civil registries were cancelled. All cultural traces that indicated a German presence were systematically erased. In Silesia, the cleansing operations were carried out under military supervision. Polish and Soviet troops escorted the displacements. On many occasions, civil resistance was met with collective punishments. The victims of those reprisals were buried in mass graves, without identification or ceremony. Some accounts collected by observers of the time mention entire populations taken to temporary camps, where overcrowding and lack of water accelerated the deaths. The exact number of deaths during this process is still a subject of study, but the most cautious estimates speak of at least 500,000 deaths, with some calculations exceeding 1 million. Most of the victims were civilians who had not participated in the war or in the administration of the Nazi regime. The logic of collective guilt imposed by the victorious powers eliminated any distinction between combatants and the common population. The psychological and social impact of these expulsions was reflected in the fragmentation of communities and the breakdown of family ties. Numerous children were separated from their parents, and in many cases adopted by local families without the possibility of reunification. Humanitarian organizations had limited access, and in some cases were prohibited from acting in the most affected areas. The Red Cross managed to document some extreme cases, but a large part of the process remained outside official records. Despite the magnitude of the event, international tribunals did not judge these facts as crimes against humanity. The dominant narrative in the post-war period prioritized reconstruction and avoided opening a debate about the legitimacy of these actions. In the divided Germany that emerged after the war, the topic was silenced for decades, both in the East and the West. Only with reunification did more detailed investigations into what had happened begin to appear. The loss of the East was not only territorial, it also meant the physical elimination of a significant part of the German population that lived beyond the new borders. What was presented as a necessary adjustment for future peace was, in practice, one of the largest ethnic cleansings of the 20th century. Through crowded trains, roads covered with bodies, and empty villages that were never repopulated by their original inhabitants, the East disappeared from the German map, leaving no room for return. Broken lives after the forced expulsion. The disappearance of the Reich turned millions of people into displaced persons without land, without a roof, and without belongings, forced to scatter through unknown territories in search of a place to settle, while disorganization and scarcity spread in all directions. They were not only those fleeing the advance of the Red Army, but entire communities expelled from eastern regions that were now under foreign control. In towns and cities in the West, train stations and rural roads were filled with columns of carts, makeshift bundles, and exhausted faces. Women with small children, malnourished elderly people, and wounded men advanced without knowing where to go. Some slept in abandoned stables, others under torn blankets in open fields. Most carried no more than what they could carry. Contagious diseases spread quickly, and access to medical care was almost non-existent. In many rural areas, local authorities were unable to manage the constant flow of newcomers. The existing records were saturated in weeks, the hospitals, temporary shelters and aid centers were overwhelmed, and small municipalities were forced to receive thousands of people with barely any resources for their own neighbors. Some villages doubled their population in a few days, schools were transformed into emergency accommodations, and public buildings were adapted as makeshift dining halls. The newcomers were called refugees, although many were still citizens of the Reich, displaced from lost regions. They were often received with suspicion, accused of increasing the pressure on scarce food or of occupying homes without permission. The distrust towards strangers grew, fueled by the continuous tension and accumulated resentment after years of war and deprivation. Cultural differences accentuated the rejection. Although they spoke German, their accents, customs and clothing betrayed their origin. In some localities they were concentrated in separate areas, isolated from community life, while rumors about their origin and behavior circulated without control. Some were linked to the old regime, which aggravated their isolation. Hunger became a daily enemy. In many places, the distribution of food was insufficient to cover minimum needs. Reduced rations, hardened bread, and watery soups were the only sustenance. Children with swollen bellies from malnutrition walked the roads while their mothers waited for hours in line in the hope of receiving something. Informal markets grew, and the few remaining valuables were exchanged for food. On the outskirts of cities, improvised settlements began to be built. Wooden houses, huts made with salvaged materials, and shelters covered with tarps formed new peripheries. There, without structure or services, they tried to rebuild a routine. Some organized informal schools, others created neighborhood assistance points, and spontaneous cooperation networks were formed to distribute firewood, cook together, or care for the sick. The legal situation of the displaced was uncertain. Many lacked documents, and the Allied administration did not have a defined policy on their status. Some tried to register as local citizens, but they encountered bureaucratic hurdles or rejection. The occupation authorities handled the matter unevenly. In some sectors, minimal protection was offered, while in others the problem was ignored. The absence of a common protocol increased the insecurity. Those who had been expelled from the East often owned properties, businesses, or stable jobs. The total loss was not only material but also of identity. Living as strangers in their own country generated a sense of rupture that was difficult to assimilate. Testimonies from the time reflect the bewilderment at a life that seemed erased from one day to the next. Some recounted how, in a matter of days, they went from living in family homes to sleeping on straw sacks in communal stables. The emotional impact was not always immediate, but it left deep marks. Children grew up without stable role models, in environments where violence, abandonment, and hopelessness were common. Schooling was interrupted for months or years. Some learned trades from an early age to help their families, while others were trapped in assistance systems that did not offer real outlets. In some places, refugees managed to form cohesive communities, re-establishing networks of trust, production cooperatives, or religious activities that gave them some stability. However, these spaces were fragile and depended on external factors such as the climate, the availability of resources, or the attitude of local authorities. A minor conflict was enough to cause a new displacement. Time did not resolve all the tensions. Years after the end of the war, disputes over housing, arable land, and jobs persisted. In some towns, clashes led to physical violence or arson. Official institutions rarely intervened effectively. Despite everything, the majority of the displaced adapted. They found ways to subsist, to integrate little by little, or at least to survive with dignity. Demographic records show that, over time, many settled permanently in their new environments. Some recovered trades, others joined the industrial networks that were beginning to be rebuilt. The children grew up as part of a generation that did not know the previous life, but inherited the weight of uprooting. What remained was a society marked by loss, but also by a silent resilience. The war had ended, but its shadow was still present on the dusty roads, in the hushed voices that spoke of what was, and in the camps that still remained on the margins of memory. Total anarchy after the surrender. For years, Germans had identified with the idea of structure and discipline, but in 1945, reality was dominated by confusion. The violence at the end of the war, the fall of institutions, the destruction of cities, the uncontrolled movement of displaced people, and the massive presence of foreign troops completely altered daily life. Traditional family dynamics were broken, social bonds were weakened, and previous norms about sexual conduct were relegated. Crime grew unchecked, and many adults saw young people as out of control. For a large part of the population, the feeling was one of defeat, emptiness, and hopelessness. Witnesses from the time described an environment where nothing offered stability or security, and what contributed most to this was the total absence of public protection. Although the German police had been a repressive instrument before the collapse, they represented a point of reference for authority, and with the sinking of the regime, even that disappeared. The disappearance of any formal structure favored the expansion of clandestine networks that began to operate outside of all authority. In agricultural regions, some grain depots and communal warehouses were taken over by armed groups that imposed their own rules and demanded payments in kind to allow access. The main routes were frequently blocked by improvised barricades, where unidentified individuals intercepted travelers to requisition food, animals, or tools. There were reports of cases where aid convoys were completely diverted before reaching their destination, and in certain localities, the exchange of goods was carried out only through informal contacts under constant surveillance. The impossibility of resorting to a recognized institution caused many families to choose to hide their belongings underground or abandon their homes during the night to avoid being stripped. The fear did not come from foreign armies, but from those who, without a uniform or official position, assumed functions of local control. The fragmentation of the country had led to small circles of local control, and survival depended increasingly on the direct relationship with those who had taken over command in each area. Children were in a particularly serious situation. Many lost their families or were separated from them during the displacements, and they wandered the streets in search of food or shelter. Some were taken in by other displaced people or by compassionate neighbors, while others were recruited by gangs that used them as lookouts or messengers. Aid organizations tried to provide support, but their resources were minimal compared to the number of people in need. Schools remained closed, teachers had died or fled, and educational buildings were used as makeshift accommodations. Adolescents who grew up without access to guidance or education easily fell into dynamics of violent survival, and theft, smuggling, or brute force became a means of life for a part of that generation. The insecurity intensified at night. When the sun went down, many cities and towns fell silent. People avoided going out for fear of being assaulted, attacked, or interrogated by groups without recognized authority. Windows were covered with blankets and doors were reinforced with furniture. In some areas, the sound of gunshots or shouts was part of the night environment. Those who had weapons kept them as the only form of defense. The idea of justice had lost its meaning. There were no operational courts, and the few remaining judges or lawyers lacked the means to act. Many files had been destroyed, and civil registries were outdated or lost, which generated an absolute legal vacuum. Even evident crimes went unpunished. Personal revenge replaced formal processes, and punishments were applied by individual decision. The decomposition was also reflected in the symbolic. The previous emblems had lost value, and no new collective reference immediately emerged. Flags were hidden or destroyed, and photographs of leaders disappeared from the walls. Public spaces showed abandonment, improvisation, and institutional emptiness. Churches tried to occupy that place, calling the community and offering spiritual support, accommodation, or food distribution, although with limited resources. The population fluctuated between exhaustion and fear, with the memory of the war present in every conversation and reconstruction as a distant goal. In that scenario, promises of a better future were perceived as abstract. The only real thing was the disorder. Each decision was uncertain. Each day brought a different threat, and living among physical, moral, and legal ruins became the new normal, without knowing when something similar to stability could return.